Chapter 28, He Who Seeks Revenge. He Who Seeks Revenge. The sun was just risen by the time the four left the inn, but the world was still as grey, heavy dark clouds boiling overhead, while rain hung in the air as fine as mist. Frithia shook her head, still unable to believe the last hour had actually happened. A gnomon appearing at her door, pale and shaken, to inform her that he had just had news his sister had been killed. Frithia so stunned it had been a while before she had spoken, and even then she had found it hard to express the intensity of her regret, just saying sorry until the word sounded hollow. Her stomach tightened as she recalled a gnomon's empty look as he had nodded his thanks, the stiff way he had recited for her what little the messenger had told him, that his sister had been found dead in her room 3 days ago under suspicious circumstances, and had since been cremated. He believed the steward of his house, Llewellyn, would have more information, and he wished to visit his home straight away, as much for the hope that his father would still be sleeping off the previous evening's excess as anything else. They were all fair enough requests, and, to be honest, Frithia would have agreed to whatever he had asked. It was all she could do. And so, she had dressed hurriedly before joining him in the hall. A gnomon had not wanted them all to go, and Frithia could not see the point in waking anyone but Jahara, Nalia hearing them gathering in the hallway and asking to attend also. A gnomon had agreed, and Frithia had written a note for the others as the women quickly dressed as well, pushing it under Aries' door before they left. Frithia pulled her cloak about her more tightly. It was a cold morning, and it seemed to have sunk into her very bones, the girl unable to stop shivering as she followed a gnomon and Jahara across the city, Nalia at her side. No one was speaking, and Frithia risked a glance to the girl next to her, Nalia returning her look with a sad smile, and they each turned back to the path before them in silence. They had crossed the river by now, the buildings around them becoming larger as they moved into the more affluent north of the city. A gnomon led them along a wide tree-lined street and down a terraced square, great houses and estates on all sides, a collection of terracotta-tiled roofs coming into view as they moved down the steps. They all belonged to the same building, and Frithia let her eyes linger over it as they drew closer. The pale sandstone manor walled on one side by the terrace, it was enclosed on the other 3 by a high wall, but she could still see the house beyond, a covered balcony set into the upper floor, thinly columned archways running the length of it with a pattern of blue and green tiles decorating the curve of each. It really was quite beautiful, and she wondered absently who lived there, a wealthy lord perhaps, or maybe a powerful mage, and Frithia could hardly believe it when a gnomon stopped at the gate, drawing a large iron key from his bag to place it in the lock, the gate opening with an angry shriek. It was his house. He led them through the gateway and down a set of steps into a large courtyard, a row of stables to their left, the house before them, and even more imposing up close, and though she had always known a gnomon had been of noble blood, it had never before occurred to her how rich his family was. Or at least, had been, for she could see now all was not as she would have expected from her first impression. The stables were empty, with gaps in the roofs where slates had been lost, and weeds were pushing their way up between the cobbles of the courtyard, a glance up revealing tiles missing from the arches she had been so admiring from afar. A gnomon looked troubled by the sight as well, his voice barely audible as he muttered something about the lack of guards, and led them across the square, the group gathering under the arches of the porch as he stepped forward to knock soundly on the door, the wood swinging open after a moment to reveal a stout dark-haired maid of middling years. "Lord Gnomon, you've returned," she gasped, shaking her head as she continued sadly, "I am so sorry for your loss." A gnomon merely nodded his thanks though and pressed on. "Sylvia, why is there no guard on the gate? Is Llewellyn awake? I would speak with him." "Llewellyn," she repeated, looking suddenly uneasy. "Sir, well, he has not worked here for months now." "Left, you say?" confirmed a gnomon with a frown. "He put up with my father for this long, what changed?"
Well, sir, Lord Cor has found himself in difficulties this last year or so, and it came to the point where, well..."
She looked embarrassed to finish, and glanced to the squire as though hoping he would end the sentence for her. But Anoman remained silent, and in the end she dropped her eyes to continue,
"Your father could no longer afford to pay him, my lord. The guards and the other servants were dismissed soon after. He keeps only 4 of us on now."
Frithha could see from Anoman's expression that this was all something of a shock for him, and she wondered whether his sister had thought to save him from worrying by not mentioning any of it.
"I see,"
he said finally, stony-faced, and Frithha felt a weight drop into her stomach as he added,
"And is my father awake?"
The woman nodded nervously, showing them through into a reception room of sorts, low benches set against 2 of the walls, a large square pool in its center fed by the rainwater that would have poured through the opening in the ceiling above, though it was shuttered that day. Anoman left them promptly, disappearing through a set of dark wooden doors to look for his father, and he clearly found him soon after. The 3 stood and sat in uncomfortable silence, while the muffled sounds of 2 men raging at each other drifted in from the adjacent room. Frithha stood leaning against the opposite wall, feeling increasingly uneasy as the moments dragged by. It was not as if she wasn't used to arguing, especially if it involved Anoman, but this was different. They were fighting with such anger, such barely concealed loathing. Across the room, she could see Jahara becoming edgy. The druid sensed it too. This place had known nothing but hatred for so long, it seemed to have seeped into the very stones. Frithha shifted nervously and went back to staring at her feet, her damp clothes clinging to her unpleasantly and serving only to increase her unease as the shouting in the next room went up a notch. She had half hoped this tragedy would reconcile Anoman with his father, but the way things seemed to be going. Suddenly, their exchange lulled, and after a moment, Anoman appeared at the doorway, his face grey with sorrow. The 3 looked up to him expectantly, but he did not even seem to see them, focusing only on her.
"Frithha, come with me to Moira's urn. I would speak with you."
Frithha just nodded and straightened, following him meekly to the other door, quite unable to hide her surprise as he opened it onto not another room but another courtyard, a verdant, albeit overgrown, garden visible through the fine veil of rain. A covered walkway ran along one side of the courtyard, and Anoman led the way, from the door they had just opened and through the door opposite into the family chapel. It was cool inside, almost cold, and she felt her back shiver under her tunic as she followed the man to the shrine, light from the stained glass windows above them dappling the stone floor with color, a familiar eye of helm hanging above the altar. The candles atop it were already lit, an ornate gold urn set between them, surrounded by flowers and, most touchingly, a worn cloth doll, and Frithha wondered who had arranged it so. Anoman's father did not seem the sort. Frithha dipped her head as the squire blessed himself, feeling increasingly awkward, stood there by the ashes of someone she had never known, while Anoman contemplated it in dark silence. Though she herself had lost many people recently and Anoman was her friend despite their constant arguments, Frithha still felt as though she had been brought into something in which she had no place. She knew she should be saying or doing something, but looking back, she found she could remember nothing of what had ever been said to her. But before she could get too fraught, Anoman broke the silence.
"Discussions,"
he began, and Frithha wondered whether she just imagined the slight stress to the word,
"with my father have confirmed what we have already been told. My sister was indeed murdered, and he believes he knows by whom. A merchant by the name of Clerk apparently has something of a vendetta against my father, and he believes the murder of my sister is just another step to ruin him. I am sad to say that for my father Moria's death probably means little more, but I must admit..."
His voice faltered and Frithha felt her heart twist.
"Admit to being most sorely grieved by this news, and yet, though the choice seems clear and right, I am hesitant to take it."
Frithha was surprised. Nothing about this seemed clear to her.
"Surely,"
he continued, his voice strengthening slightly,
if Serk killed my sister I must avenge her. Yet killing for the purpose of revenge is murder by the tenets of the order. I know not what I should do.
Anomen turned, fixing her with that confused desperate gaze, and Frith's heart seemed to stop. He was asking her for advice. But what could she say? She didn't know anything about the situation, about honor, or tenets. She usually, when confronted with a problem, just did what she felt like at the time, breezing through life without the restrictions of intangible things like pride or vows. But, she considered, she always was very aware of the restrictions of her own heart. Fritha had come to realize lately that others did not necessarily see things quite as clearly as she did, and it was then she found herself thinking something she had never even considered possible. What would Welland do? Fritha advising people like herself was fine, but if you were advising someone like Anomen, with all these invisible rules surrounding them, then you needed someone with the same rulebook. She looked up at him, his pale blue eyes watching her intently. Welland would have served the law, would have served his vows, however undesired the result.
Anomen, though sometimes it may feel warranted, killing for revenge is murder. I know there are some who would walk the path anyway though, believing the end justifies the means.
She sent him a gentle look.
Only you can decide whether you are one of them.
Anomen sighed and shook his head, eyes lingering on the ornate vase beneath them, the surrounding flowers seeming inappropriately bright.
What you say holds true, yet, as my father says, I am honor-bound to find my sister's killer and take his life. You are honor-bound to the vows you made to the order,
she reminded gently, his brow furrowing as he turned back to her, his tone almost challenging.
But what other choice have I? Well, what of the courts here?
She reasoned, surprised it was she rather than he suggesting such a course.
If Serk is the murderer, then he must most definitely be made to pay for his crime. If,
Anomen repeated evenly,
you do not believe he is guilty.
Fritha shrugged.
I do not know, but I cannot just go on the word of your father, especially when he seems to hold such hatred for the man.
Anomen finally agreed.
You are right. I feel it in my bones.
Fritha felt awash with relief. She did not relish the idea of getting involved in some bloody feud and knew the others would be reluctant to partake in any revenge attack, however justified it seemed. Though Anomen was not always the easiest person to get along with, she would have disliked to part ways with him at such a difficult time in his life.
We shall take this matter before the magistrate. My father's vengeance be damned!
Anomen announced defiantly, banishing the last of Fritha's worries. This was the right decision. The weather had worsened in the time they had spent at the Dulrin estate, and outside the rain was hammering against the cobbles, Fritha expecting to hear a peal of thunder at any moment. The main council building was but a few streets from Anomen's home, and the group made the way quickly, pushing through the heavy oak doors to enter a grey stone entrance hall, corridors, and stairs leading from it, a circle of 6 stars on a field of blue picked out in the tiles underfoot. They all crowded together just before the doors, pushing back hoods and shaking off wet cloaks, a passing clerk sending a pointed look to the water they were pooling on the stone tiles as another younger man in dark grey robes bustled over to them with an officious air.
The city bounties are on display in the west of the building, just take. We are here to see the magistrate,
interrupted Jahara with her usual respect for authority. The clerk looked surprised, but recovered quickly.
Oh, do you have an appointment? No, but it is a matter of great importance,
Nalia assured him with a stern confidence, the man looking to each of them before seeming to decide that just dismissing them would not be an option.
Oh well, I suppose I could see if the magistrate can fit you in,
he sighed, in the manner of one about to move mountains.
Your name? Anomendelrin,
said the man himself, speaking for the first time since he had left his home.
Son of Lord Cor. Very well, wait here please.
The clerk sighed again and hurried off down the corridor, reappearing moments later looking rather pleased with himself.
I have spoken with the magistrate and she can give you a few moments just before the 11th hour, if you wish to return then.
We'll wait, chorused Fritha and Jahara. The clerk seemed to just manage to suppress rolling his eyes and gestured to the bench behind them.
As you wish,
he sighed and left to return to his duties, Fritha turning to the girl next to her.
Could you go back and let the others know what's happening please, Nalya?
The girl nodded and threw up her hood to step back out into the rain, leaving them to take the bench they had been proffered and wait. The air was cool and still, people gliding back and forth along the hallway, no one speaking above a whisper. The time dragged on, painfully slow, the bells in the tower above marking the hour 3 times before. At last, the young clerk returned and they were led along a hallway and into a large airy room, banners from various houses and guilds hanging from the walls, the high windows showing the boiling grey sky beyond. At the back of the room a long table was set upon a dais, 3 high-backed wooden chairs stood behind it though 2 were empty, the third occupied by a short, stern-looking woman of late middle age, her pale blonde curls streaked with grey. Her eyebrows were thick and few shades darker than her hair, giving her the appearance of one permanently frowning, though her eyes were kind as she beckoned them forward.
Please be upstanding for the Right Honourable Magistrate, Bylana Ianulin,
announced the clerk self-importantly, which Fritha thought was a bit of a waste of time since all bar the woman herself were stood anyway, and the magistrate seemed to be suppressing a sigh as well, dismissing the man with a nod.
Good business, citizens, she greeted amiably as she turned to them. Is there aught I can help you with?
A no-man stepped forward to bow politely.
Yes, Honourable Magistrate. I am seeking information on the murder of my sister, Moira Dulrin. Ah, you must be Lord Cor's son, a no-man isn't it?
Bylana confirmed with a gentle smile, sighing ruefully as she continued.
I am afraid there is little I can tell you regarding your sister's death. What do you mean?
Said a no-man, taking another step forward.
Surely you have found evidence to link Sarek to her murder. The man will be brought to justice, will he not?
The woman shook her head, sympathetic but resolute.
I am sorry, but there is insufficient evidence to connect Sarek Farad to the crime. I am aware of your family's feud with the merchant, but a motive is not enough without witnesses or evidence. The rule of law must prevail. There must be something that can be done,
he cried, and Fritha winced at the stricken tone of his voice.
Moira's death cannot go unanswered. Unanswered?
Bylana repeated, a certain sternness creeping into her manner.
I am truly sorry for your loss, but there is no evidence it was Sarek. Take vengeance on the merchant and he responds in kind and the hostility continues unabated.
The woman sighed, sending him a gentle look.
Do you not think it is time for this feud to end? I do not know.
He murmured, turning at last from the woman to glance to her, and Fritha bit her lip, having to force herself to meet his gaze as she quietly replied,
If there is no evidence, a no-man.
Next to her, Jahara nodded.
We cannot act outside the law,
she said firmly, reiterating the words of the magistrate, her voice full of conviction as she continued.
Men such as these are often caught out by their own schemes. If it truly was Sarek, then he will suffer his punishment in time.
But the squire just nodded and turned back to Bylana, his look empty.
I thank you for your time, magistrate,
he said finally, bowing again before turning to leave, and in silence they followed. End of chapter.